What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. I have to pick up where we left off with Jack Johnson. I have him ranked number 8 of the greatest fighter of all times in my all-time ranking list. Now, Jack Johnson had taken on Stanley Ketchel. Stanley Ketchel was the current middleweight champion at this time. And it was frustrating to the establishment because Jack Johnson kept laying down all the white heavyweight hopes that they put in front of Jack Johnson. It's a shame we lived in that kind of society, but that's the way it was. And Jack Johnson, who rightfully belonged in that ring as heavyweight champion, was always treated as an outcast. And most of it was because, and I wouldn't call it arrogance, but Jack Johnson was very confident. He showed his gold teeth, and he flaunted with white women. And the establishment did not like that. So they would hire Stanley Ketchel. And this fight was supposed to be somewhat of an exhibition. Both men had the understanding that it would basically be somewhat of a glorified sparring match. No one was to get hurt, and they would split the movie rights. But it turns out that Jack Johnson was a heavier opponent. He was a heavyweight, and Stanley Ketchel was a middleweight. So when Jack Johnson would pour out a snappy left jab, it hurt Stanley Ketchel, actually dropped him. Stanley Ketchel had a hot temper to begin with. He got up, he didn't like it. So the first opportunity that he would find, he would shoot an overhand right that would land on the side of the head of Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson would go down. He didn't like it. So he would immediately get up, walk right over Stanley Ketchel, hit him with an overhand right hand, and Stanley Ketchel would go down like a sack of potatoes. He dropped him execution style, crucifixion style. Looked like a snowman laying on that canvas. So Jack Johnson would move on to bigger and better things. But to get back to July 4th, 1910, when he would knock out gentleman J. Jeffries, who was known as the Boilermaker at that time. He knocked him out in the 15th round. And Jim Corbett, who was supposed to be the model of boxing, he won 61 rounds with Peter Jackson, the Black Prince. Jim Jeffries would be heckling Jack Johnson, called him the N-word, called him a black monkey. Everything under the kitchen sink he would call him. And it's unfortunate, but that's just the way society was at that time. Jim Jeffries and Jim Corbett were friends, although Jim Jeffries had knocked out Jim Corbett. But they ganged up on Jack Johnson because they didn't want to have a black fighter as a heavyweight champion. And after this fight with Jim Jeffries would be over, little black boys were put in full Nelsons with grown white men because they would have their sons beat the little black boys half to death. This actually happened. They would spit at the little black boy, and every time they would punch him in the face and punch him in the chest and punch him in the gut. The name Jim Jeffries will be spouted out. And this is a part of American history that is swept under the rug. But it's part of understanding what the black fighter had to go through, what society was like at that time. Houses were being burned down. Cars were being overturned. Bricks were being thrown in the windows in the urban community. They were afraid to go outside. Anytime you would have a grown man going to work, his life could be threatened. And there was a lot of hangings going on at that time. So it made things worse for black fighters to get opportunities moving forward, because governors and promoters didn't want to be a part of that. Their interest was to make money. Their interest was also to have a white champion. So Jack Johnson would then take on Jess Willard. And he'd be stopped in 26 rounds because he was nailed with the Mann Act. You see, Jack Johnson had married somewhat of an underage girl. But that's not what they were trying to nab him for. They were trying to find a way to hustle the heavyweight championship belt away from Jack Johnson. And they came up with all kinds of schemes. They would send women in to clubs and bars after Jack Johnson, taunting him to try to get him in a hotel and get him for rape. When those things didn't work, they would go to the Mann Act. Now, the Mann Act was not designed for a specific person. It was normally designed for a group of women to be placed across state lines in prostitution purposes. And so they would nail him on the Mann Act. So he would flee the country. And one of the agreements that Jack Johnson had stated in his memoir is that if he laid down for Jess Willard, he would be allowed to come back to the country without being arrested. Now, Jack Johnson would take that story to his grave. But that's what we know, that's what we have. But Jack Johnson was a proud man. And it's very interesting that he would do something like that. But that's the story that we must live with. And his fight would take place in 1915. It would be on a racetrack in Cuba, Havana. Jess Willard, lumbering giant, would now become the heavyweight champion of the world. Now, the referee was Jack Welch. Ironically, he is the referee who was involved in a lot of very, I would say, scandalous and controversial fights. He was the referee who was a part of the Mexican Joe Rivers and Ad Wargas fight, where you would have a double knockdown, and Jack Welch would be counting out Mexican Joe Rivers as he was assisting up Ad Wargas. And he was hired by Ad Wargas for the rest of his career. Now, 1911, after the Jim Jeffries fight, to 1915, you would have the white heavyweight champions. Now, they had their own division now. And when Jess Willard would knock out Jack Johnson, that white heavyweight division went away. Now, Johnson would open up a club when he would retire. It was known as the Supper Club. It was originally known as Club Deluxe. The Supper Club was the second floor of Club Deluxe. Jack Johnson would buy out that floor. And in that club, he would have whiskey, booze, prostitution, gambling, everything that men at that time would be willing to be engaged with. He would make a lot of money. Johnson's club was on the second floor. And the first floor, like I said, it was Club Deluxe. But you had a man by the name of Owen Madden. He strong-armed the establishment. And he took the club away from Jack Johnson. He told Jack Johnson that he would give him 20% of each night's earnings. Jack Johnson never received a dime. Now, who was Owen Vincent Madden? He was born December 18th, 1891, in England, 25 Somerset Road. He had a mother and father, Mary and Francis. And his family would relocate to Liverpool, and his sister Elizabeth would move to the United States, 352 10th Avenue in Manhattan. Owen and his brothers Martin stayed. They stayed in Lee's, 36 Springfield Terrace, until 1902. Owen had served 10 years of a 20-year sentence in Sing Sing. And he was the former gangster who was arrested for bootlegging in Canada. He would bootleg Canadian whiskey during Prohibition, and he was also involved in racketeering and prostitution. And he would use the milk fund trade as somewhat of a cover-up for alcohol. And Owen would employ George Raff, who would eventually work with an outlaw. And George Raff would buy out the contract of Henry Armstrong, who would become a 3-weight division champion, 19 title defenses as a welterweight. I have him ranked number 4 as the greatest fighter of all times. Now, Owen had purchased the first floor of the Club Deluxe. And when he did that, he changed the name to the Cotton Club. Now, the thing about the Cotton Club, why it was named that, is because it was only designed for white audiences. And there's an old slang saying, you're out of your cotton picking mind. And the reason why they would say that, because the black slaves would ask to go in the house to drink some water. And that's what the slave owners would tell them. Are you out of your cotton picking mind? So since Jack Johnson was a black fighter, and Owen Matting would snatch the club away from Jack Johnson, as he looked at Jack Johnson as a slave, Jack Johnson asked for his 20%. He asked him, are you out of your cotton picking mind? And he said, that's a great name. I'm going to call it the Cotton Club. And that's how that club got its name. Now, Jack Johnson was a very proud man. He would open up other clubs in Chicago and other states. But that was his bread and butter. But he had to move on because there was not much he can do about it during that time. So he would go on and patent a wrench. It was a pipe wrench designed to tighten and loosen up pipes. It was a brilliant idea. But they would name it the monkey wrench because that's how they saw Jack Johnson. Now, it's said that that is not the case, but that was the case. And it's just unfortunate. That's the society in which we lived. And the reason why I bring these topics up, because I have to remind us all of what the black fighter, the black man had to go through during that time. And that's why I say when you judge fighters, you have to judge the fighter in the time in which he came, because life was much harder for black fighters during that time. The opportunities fighters have today, the black fighters didn't have in their time. And to be able to accomplish what they have accomplished is beyond ordinary. So Jack Johnson had married Mary Austin, 1927. She was a black seamstress. Clara Kerr, 1903. She was a black prostitute. Elma Lola, 1907. Bella Shriver, she was a prostitute. Jack Johnson had opened that club in Chicago. And that club would do very well. But Al Capone would walk to Jack Johnson and pretty much give him the same speech that Owen Matting did. Now, you had a man by the name of Keelshawn Mountain Landis. He was a baseball commissioner. 1932 Olympic Games. One of the greatest fighters, in fact, I have him the greatest greatest trainer of all times. And his name was Harry Wiley Sr. Fought in the YMCA out of New Jersey. And he would come over to Manhattan. And he would work on a Salem Crescent Club. Now, he was a former fighter, but he would deliver ice and carry those big blocks of ice up the stairs. You didn't have elevators during those days. And you had to get it up the stairs before the ice would completely melt. And he did that. He would throw it over his shoulder. And you had this big hook that you would pretty much stab the ice. And you would throw it over your shoulder and walk up the stairs. Well, he was trying to get ice either in the cab, or his car, or out the car. Taxi cab, I hit him and pinned him to the car, and he broke his leg. So he couldn't He couldn't fight anymore, but he would become a trainer. He was always good at hand wrapping. And he would be a water boy for Jack Dempsey, and he would hand wrap the fist of Sam Langford towards the end of his career. He would train a fighter by the name of Hickmaya Hurricane. His name was Lou Ambers. He would train Canada Lee, Sammy Mandel. He had Danny Cox, Louis Spider Valentine. Later on, he would have Smitty, who would wind up becoming Sugar Ray Robinson. Well, he was the coach for that particular team. He was elected to be the coach for that team. And he saw that black fighters were not being treated fairly. They didn't get the food and they didn't get the proper energy. They were getting powdered milk. So he went into Commissioner Lander's office and he confronted him about it. And he said, I can have this team win gold medals across the board. But I have to be honest with you, and I'm paraphrasing here. Black fighters are not being treated fairly. And they're going to need this and they're going to need that. White fighters were getting steaks and black fighters were getting leftover food. And just to somewhat paraphrase from my understanding, Landis had quoted to Harry Wiley Sr., listen, and he called him the N-word. He said, don't you ever come into my office telling me anything of how to run my business. Matter of fact, you can get the hell out of here. And he fired him. Now, with the tutelage of Harry Wiley Sr., the Olympics would wind up bringing home 5 medals. 2 gold and 3 bronze. And one of the medalists was a fighter by the name of Lou Salica. He would want to become a bantamweight champion. Well, he wound up becoming the commissioner of baseball. And I brought that up to tell you that this is the time in which Jack Johnson, Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, Harry Wills, Sam McVeigh. They were the first wave of Black Murderers Row. When you go to the lower divisions, you would have Jack Blackburn. You would have a fighter by the name of Fast Black, Ruth Turner. You had Dave Holly. All these fighters were treated equally as bad. So their careers didn't turn out as it should have because of those lack of opportunities. So I did a video on Joe Louis. And Joe Louis would become the second Black heavyweight champion in boxing history. And by this time, the Black community was waiting for someone to look up to. They didn't have anyone to look up to that they could feel proud of until Joe Louis came along. Because the stigma was that Jack Johnson had humiliated the establishment. And so they made it much harder for Black fighters and Black human beings to live an equal life, to be proud of themselves, because they were afraid that this would happen once again. And so when Joe Louis would win a fight and look spectacular in doing so, when the Black man and Black woman went to work, they went to work feeling proud. They couldn't wait to get up to go to work. And they would overhear a white person talk about Joe Louis and how he was able to knock the man out, and they would smile. Each day they felt as though they were going to be treated with the same respect. And each day they would be disappointed. And as I go through my top 10, we will see how time started to evolutionize. It would change. But Jack Johnson really, he really voiced this opinion during a time when black human beings couldn't voice their opinions. So Joe Louis, after every fight, and families would listen on the radio, and no one made a sound. Everyone would take a shower, take a bath. They would put on the best suit, and they would sit around the radio. They would go down and get their shoes shined. And it was a proud moment in the urban communities: Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, Harlem, New York. And when Joe Louis won, it was probably like Christmas. Joe Louis had that impact because of Jack Johnson on the African American community. And they would throw toilet paper out the window. They would run outside, honk, cars would honk their horns. Everyone would be cheering after the fight. Because it was a moment that they cherished. They felt proud. They felt as though they meant something. They felt that at some point, someone who looked like them can contribute something to society. Although they contributed all their values themselves. But their names were not in the paper. They were not being talked about. And it was just a proud moment. So Jack Johnson really put an impact in the minds of society. And he fought some great, great fighters along the way. And so I often ask myself, why didn't Jack Johnson give the Joplin Ghost, Jeff Clark, or the Boston Bone Crusher, Sam Langford, or the Oxnard Cyclone, Sam McVeigh, the Brown Panther, Harry Wills, Joe Jeanette, the Hoboken Smasher, an opportunity at his heavyweight championship title? I don't know if it was an agreement. I don't know if it was outside forces that prevented him from doing so. I know he gave Battling Jim Johnson a shot before his loss to Jess Willard in Cuba Havana. But it makes me wonder what really took place. I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. All great fights and all great fighters would never be forgotten on my channel. Jack Johnson is my number 8 greatest fighter of all times. Thanks for watching.
Just like that river, I've been running ever since. It's brother, help me.